Before we begin, if you're listening from somewhere quiet, let us know what time it is and where you're listening from down in the comments. We love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel, and if you find comfort in these forgotten pieces of history, consider subscribing. It helps us bring you more calm, curious, and quietly haunting stories, night after night. Now, take a slow breath. Let the past settle in. Let's begin. Asterisk, in the early months of the year 03 BCE, the city of Chang'an was quiet beneath the weight of ritual and rank. In the inner quarters of a merchant's home, the shriek of new life echoed faintly into lacquered halls, swallowed quickly by thick curtains and the whispered rustle of silk. A baby girl had been born, but no firecrackers sounded. No gifts were exchanged. There was no red silk tied to the doorpost, no wine spilled in joy. She was born quietly because she was a daughter in the Han Dynasty, spanning more than 4 centuries from 206 BCE to 220 CE. The arrival of a girl was not cause for sorrow, exactly, but for silence, a pause, a glance exchanged between elder women. Her fate, already weighted by what she would not inherit, was marked not with music or a feast, but with chores and unasked questions. The cradle carved for her may have once belonged to an older sister. Her birth would be recorded not on the family genealogy tablet, but on the periphery, if at all, within the deeply Confucian fabric of Han society. Daughters were both necessary and invisible, born to serve, to marry, and to vanish into other households. The midwife, often a woman past her childbearing years, would carry out a set of soft rituals. She'd wrap the baby in cotton gauze, rarely silk unless the family was noble and stand. Place her on a low straw mat, not in the center of the room as 4 sons, but tucked beside the matron's bed. An offering would be made, not to heaven, but to the kitchen god, the deity of domestic order and obedience. The message was clear. Her destiny belonged inside, across the empire. The treatment of newborns reflected a hierarchy, not of love, but of utility. Sons extended the family name and ensured rights were passed from father to son. They inherited land, wealth, and the right to make offerings to ancestors, a vital cultural duty. Daughters, in contrast, became part of someone else's family, absorbed into another household, and erased from her birth clan's ancestral tablet in elite homes. A daughter's name might never be carved in jade or inked on silk scrolls. Instead, she might be recorded only as 3rd child, female, or not at all. The household diviner might still be summoned, but his words held little weight for her fate. His interest was in omens surrounding sons. The date of her birth might be considered only in terms of auspicious marriage pairings. Nothing more, yet, for all this quiet, her world was still layered with meaning. The clothes she wore, often yellow or brown, the earth tones reserved for the lower ranks of traumas. The household whispered her place in the social order. Her ears might be pierced before she could crawl. Her feet, not yet walking, might already be viewed with suspicion for walking too far one day, away from the family that bore her. These customs weren't universal across all classes. Among the poor, sons and daughters often worked side by side, and to daughter survival could mean one more pair of hands at the loom or rice paddy. But even there, the ancient belief lingered. A son might one day raise you up. A daughter only drains Confucian teachings from the Book of Rites, outlined ideal familial hierarchies, and while they didn't condemn daughters outright, they reinforced obedience, submission, and the moral role of a woman within the home. A daughter was to obey her father in childhood, her husband in marriage, and her son in widowhood. Her role, clearly defined, offered little room for personal ambition or recognition. Silence, then, was not just a lack of celebration. It was policy, it was structure. It was a societal breath drawn in and held tight. But what did these girls think as they grew into women inside these structures? Did they sense the absence of their names from the stone tablets? Did they notice the difference in tone when their brothers entered the room? Occasionally, there were exceptions. Certain noble daughters, those who bore royal blood or married into power, carved out influence behind veils and walls. Empress LZ, for instance, ruled with an iron hand after her husband, Emperor Kozu's death. But her strength was feared, not praised. Her name was etched in history with caution, not celebration. Powerful women were warnings, not ideals. Back in the merchant's home in Chang'an, the newborn girl would grow. Perhaps she'd become adept at weaving or learn to read characters quietly when no one was looking. Perhaps she'd serve tea in silence, memorizing the footsteps of her father and guessing his moods. And perhaps one day she would leave traded in marriage like a commodity, her silence sealed into another household's walls. Yet still, she lived. She endured. She may have laughed quietly behind embroidered sleeves, carved tiny dreams into wood scraps, or watched the stars with unspoken curiosity, even without a name in the family record. She was a life fully lived, hidden beneath layers of silence, but no less real. Was that silence, the quiet that met her birth, a cultural form of grief? Or was it simply custom, too old to question? Asterisk, she was never told her name meant fragrance of plum blossom. It was chosen by her grandmother, who had seen a tree bloom too early that spring. But no one called her by it outside the family walls. In formal gatherings, she was referred to as Unsan third daughter. Its term was practical, spare. It wasn't meant to belittle, simply followed a pattern. Sons were ranked for inheritance. Daughters were listed like linen in a chest. By her 7th year, she could embroider a lotus flower with 10 different stitch types. She could light incense without coughing and fold rice dumplings with barely a wrinkle. Her lessons were not those of poetry or military tactics like her brothers. Her education revolved around stillness, listening, and patience, the core pillars of a Han daughter's life. Her mother had whispered warnings, too. Never speak first. Never ask twice. Never meet a man's eyes unless he is family. These weren't punishments. They were protections. Within the thick-walled compounds of Chang'an, women navigated their lives like river mist, noticed only when they refused to disappear. Behind every silk curtain, there was a ritual. When she entered womanhood, her first bleeding marked with careful superstition. Her bedding was burned, not washed, burned. She was not to touch fresh water or look into mirrors for 3 days. Blood was sacred, but feared. It marked her as a vessel of continuation, a future mother of sons, if fate permitted. The household began to treat her differently. Her voice softened further. Her meals were brought separately, timed to avoid overlapping with men. Marriage. Proposals would come soon, not as questions to her, but as discussions over wine between fathers and matchmakers. The tools of that trade were small things: a face fan, a dowry ledger. A girl's reputation could hinge on whether she was seen laughing too freely at the well, or whether she delivered tea with her eyes lowered just the right amount. These details, dull and obsessive, decided the shape of her future. She was not alone. Across the empire, millions of girls lived similarly quiet lives, some in brick homes with painted rafters, others in clay dwellings with reed roofs. The rituals changed slightly by region, but echoed the same principle. A daughter was temporary, her loyalty was borrowed, her usefulness defined by her transition to another man's home. And so it was that marriages were announced in fanfare, but births of daughters often were not. Sons were celebrated in public with wine-soaked feasts. Daughters were bundled in soft cloth and passed from midwife to mother in silence. But these daughters endured. Some found strange paths to power. The archives of Han history contain brief mentions of midwives who became indispensable to palace births, herbalists who treated royal ailments, or wet nurses who whispered secrets into the ears of future emperors. These women wielded soft power, hidden, unrecorded, but real in border regions. Women sometimes took on roles as mediators, translators, and weavers of alliances through marriage diplomacy. A daughter sent across a mountain pass might prevent a war with a tribal chief. Her silence, in that case, might have saved thousands of lives within the great city walls of Luoyang. Women participated in religious ceremonies as priestesses of local shrines, especially to mother goddesses or fertility spirits. These shrines, small, often forgotten by official histories, were essential spaces for women to voice fears, prayers, and frustrations. Here, they chanted aloud. Here, silence was broken. And yet, outside those shrines, the quiet resumed. Not all women accepted this as fate. In private letters discovered on bamboo slips, we read hints of resistance. A letter from a young wife in the western provinces, dated roughly 35 CE, laments, "My tongue is worn smooth from being bitten. I have thoughts, but no place to set them." Another, more chilling, asks, "If a woman dies before bearing a son, does her soul wander, still most endured?" They became the weavers of robes, the arrangers of ancestral tablets, the mothers of sons who would one day speak in court. Their labor was unseen but essential. Their names might have vanished from records, but not from memory, whispered by daughters and nieces as caution, as comfort, or as quiet rebellion. For each daughter born without celebration, a system remained intact, one that needed her labor, her silence, her body, but not her name. Sometimes, girls were cherished. In wealthier or more liberal households, a daughter might be taught poetry, perhaps even allowed to recite it. Families without sons might adopt unconventional customs, offering daughters more visible roles in lineage continuation. But these cases were the exception, not the rule. Most often, her existence was quiet, methodical, and folded neatly into the routines of the home. Her wedding would arrive with more ceremony than her birth. Her departure from her childhood home might finally earn her a red ribbon or a procession, but even that was symbolic. She was being handed over. She may never return. Not truly. Even the dreams she dreamed were trained toward others, toward being good, obedient, generous. She had desires of her own. They were kept beneath her tongue, tied into her hair, or stitched into the corners of robes meant for her future husband's household. Why did they continue to do this? Why, generation after generation, did women raise daughters to be silent about their own births? Was it love disguised as preparation, or submission woven so tightly into culture that it could no longer be untangled? Asterisk, she was 20 when the matchmaker arrived with a lacquered box. It wasn't a surprise. The household had been preparing for weeks, exchanging coded letters, weighing jade pieces, haggling over dowry bundles like sacks of grain. Her mother had polished her teeth with crushed oyster shell and brushed her hair until it shone like black glass. Everything was quiet, precise, and oddly impersonal. The young man she was to marry was the second son of a bureaucrat from the northern commandery. He was known for his penmanship, not for wealth, but his older brother had no heir yet. This small detail made the match worth considering. The first son remained childless. The second son's line would inherit the household name and duties. A daughter could not hope for more in this system, to become a hinge in someone else's lineage. When she left her family home, it was in a red palanquin, eyes lowered beneath heavy veils. She was not supposed to look back. Her feet had never touched the outer courtyard steps before, yet now she crossed them in silence, escorted by chanting women and flute players paid to be cheerful. Her brothers did not walk with her. Her father did not weep. This too was tradition, and in her new home she became a wife. Then, not long after, a mother. Her first child was a boy. The household erupted in joy. Red cloth was hung on the doors. Rice wine flowed for days. Guests came with scrolls of blessing. In her name, the one that had been whispered and hidden all her life was finally spoken with respect. She was now mother of Zhang, a title, finally. But when her second child was a girl, the celebration was markedly muted. A few sweet cakes were delivered from the kitchens. A maid whispered, "Congratulations." That was all. Even the gods at the ancestral altar received only a cursory offering. Yet she loved her daughter, perhaps because she remembered what it felt like to be born without a name, to be spoken of only in utility, to be raised with precision. But without ceremony, she taught the girl to read early, using her husband's old study scrolls. She sang old folk songs to her in the dusk hours when servants dozed. She saved scraps of silk to embroider a private keepsake quilt, squares of stories stitched with quiet defiance. Other women in the village began doing the same, quietly. It was not revolution, it was not public, but it was change. Small and slow, like water-cutting stone in palace records from the Eastern Han period. There are occasional mentions of women who raised unusually educated daughters. Some of these daughters became scribes, midwives with herbal knowledge, or even tutors. In wealthier households, they did not shake the empire, but they existed, cracks in the walls of silence. By 65 CE, Empress Ma, wife of Emperor Ming, had started to shift court expectations around virtue and learning. While still confined to domestic ideals, the writings from her court encouraged moral education for girls of noble birth. The message was clear. Obedient daughters were still expected, but now it could also be thoughtful. In local temples, shrines to female ancestors began to emerge, humble and sparsely recorded, yet present. Some communities even began commemorating daughters who died in childbirth, or who sacrificed themselves for family honor, by engraving their names on stone. These memorials were not common, and many were later worn smooth by time or destroyed in war. But the act of carving them at all marked a shift by the 2nd century CE. Silence around daughters was still prevalent, but no longer absolute. Back in the merchant's household, generations later, a curious boy asked his grandmother why there was no feast the day his mother was born. She smiled, and instead of answering, she handed him a small, faded scroll tied with a frayed red ribbon. Inside were recipes, mending instructions, a story written in her neat, careful hand. No one had ever seen it before. It was titled, "For the Girl No One Celebrated," because even if the world did not cheer, she had lived, she had learned, she had stitched herself into history, not with drums or firecrackers, but with quiet endurance. And perhaps that's the heart of it, that for every daughter born into silence, a different kind of story was being written. Not one of triumph, but of presence, of surviving long enough to teach another daughter to listen, to remember, and maybe to speak. What becomes of a society that builds its walls with silence? And what happens when one generation finally whispers loud enough to be heard? Asterisk in the dry hills of 13th century Aragon, a narrow stone house overlooked a field of fading lavender. The summer had not been kind. Rain had fallen late, and the wheat cracked before harvest. Inside that stone house, in a darkened upper room, lit only by a single oil lamp, a notary dipped his quill into ink and drew a thin line through a girl's name. She had been listed on the preliminary draft of her father's inheritance charter. The scribe had included her under possible distribution of movable property, meaning, at most, a dowry chest, some kitchen implements, and perhaps a few goats. But now the family had received word. Her older brother's marriage had been secured to a wealthier family in Valencia. The daughter's name was no longer needed. Her father didn't hate her. He prayed over her every morning, called her mi Flor Pequega, and insisted she take fig jam with her porridge when there was enough to share. But affection did not equal inheritance, not in Aragon, not when she was a daughter. Under the fueros, the legal codes that governed Aragon during the High Middle Ages, daughters could technically inherit. Theoretically, they were considered legal persons with rights to receive property if there were no male heirs. But the reality was more fragile than the parchment it was written on. Inheritance was not merely legal, it was cultural. The land passed through male lines, names passed through male lines, even obligations to the church, offerings, tithes, and annual bequests were structured through sons. A daughter's place in this structure was temporary, provisional. If her father died and there were no sons, she might inherit, but only until she married, at which point her husband assumed control. And if sons were born after her inheritance had been temporarily granted, the property was returned to them. She was merely a vessel, a placeholder. This was not unique to Aragon, but the contradictions were particularly vivid here. The crown of Aragon had undergone legal evolution during the 12th and 13th centuries, blending Visigothic customs, Roman law, and Christian ecclesiastical authority. Women could testify in court, own dowries, and even manage property in certain cases, but the line between these rights and actual authority was thin, especially when it came to land. Land was memory. Land was identity. A son who inherited a field inherited a social position. A daughter, inheriting the same, only delayed its return to the male line. So the girl in the stone house grew up knowing the boundaries of her family's wheat field, a T, but not because it would ever be hers. She walked it with her mother to gather herbs. She skirted its edge on feast days, watching the men set up maypoles and prayer banners. She was part of the land's rhythm, but not its future. She asked once innocently what would happen if her brother died without sons. Her mother's answer was immediate: "We do not wish for death." It was both a rebuke and a warning. Even to consider a girl as ere meant disaster had struck. A plague, a war, a tragedy. His daughters inherited only when everything else had failed. Still, there were exceptions. In some Aragonese mountain villages, particularly near the Pyrenean borderlands, families with no sons occasionally passed land to daughters, but only with strong legal strings attached. Contracts were written to ensure the daughter's husband took the family name and swore to protect the ancestral line. These contracts, called carta di dotatio, were elaborate and precise, but they weren't born of fairness. They were born of necessity. Even then, village gossip followed such families for generations. A man who married into a woman's name was considered diminished. His children might be mocked as hijos de la faja, children of the sash, a phrase implying femininity and weakness. Back in the dry lavender hills, the notary finished the revised charter. The daughter would receive a dowry, 2 wool cloaks, a comb made of horn, and a chest with brass hinges. She would be married by next spring. Her name would disappear from the household's inheritance records entirely. This was the pattern. Generation after generation, some daughters accepted it quietly, finding small power in managing household goods, yet in influencing family alliances, or in teaching sons who would later own everything they once touched. Others resisted subtly. A letter discovered in the municipal archives of Huesca from 1279 details dispute in which 3 sisters refused to accept the marriage arrangements tied to their dowries. They demanded a larger share of movable property after their father's death. The case reached a local bishop. The verdict was unsurprising. The sisters were reminded of their duty to the household's stability, and the case was closed without action. But the letter remained. The record of protest remained. How many other such voices were lost? Not for lack of speaking, but for lack of being heard. Why did a system that relied so heavily on women's labor reward them with so little? Claim to its fruits. Asterisk, the night before her wedding, she sat beside the cedar chest that would become her dowry. Her mother lit a tallow candle, placed a warm stone near her feet, and said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, she lifted the lid of the chest and began to inventory its contents for the last time. One woolen tunic embroidered at the cuffs, a spindle wrapped in flax, a set of wooden spoons carved by her grandfather. Small things, each practical yet heavy with symbolic weight. To the eye of the law, these were assets, items of value meant to travel with her, marking the only wealth she would carry from one household into another. To her family, they were memory and separation, a silent transaction wrapped in linen and iron hinges. In 13th century Aragon, Materi was a daughter's only legal tether to economic worth, but it was not framed as her wealth. Rather, it was framed as a liability absorbed by her husband's household. The dowry was not simply a gift, it was payment, compensation for the burden of a bride. A woman, especially one without brothers, was seen as a potential drain on her husband's estate if no property came with her. This created a strange tension. Daughters were born into households where their silence and obedience were praised. Yet the moment they left to marry, their value was suddenly measurable in coins, linen, and livestock. What had been invisible within the family became numerically exact when converted into dowry. Fathers negotiated fiercely over these sums. Dowries were not fixed. They rose and fell with the status of the groom's family, the reputation of the bride, and even the weather. In a bad harvest year, a girl's dowry might be halved. In a year of abundant olives or wheat, a few extra goats might sweeten the bargain. Women did not sit in on these negotiations. Matchmakers, fathers, and village clerics met in shaded courtyards or behind tavern doors, writing figures into charcoal notes and sealing them with wax. A girl's entire future could be altered by how much land her father was willing to release, and sometimes dowries were deliberately inflated, not out of love, but as cover, because dowries served another purpose. They disguised the shame of having no sons. Inheritance laws in Aragon emphasized the centrality of male succession. But when a family had only daughters, the social pressure to appear strong, fertile, and secure remained. A large dowry created the illusion of abundance. If a man could provide a dowry large enough to attract a noble son-in-law, he could save face, even if it cost him his last vineyard. Thus, dowries were not just economic tools, they were symbols of desperation and pride, and they could be clawed back. If a marriage dissolved by death, annulment, or scandal, the dowry was, in theory, returned to the woman or her family. But in practice, this was rare. Husbands' families often withheld goods, citing damage, depreciation, or moral failure. If a woman had not borne sons, or if rumors of misconduct followed her, the dowry was considered forfeited. In one case, from Zaragoza in 1293, a woman named Jezebel filed a complaint to the bishop's court seeking the return of her dowry after her husband died of fever. The court found in her favor, but his brothers had already divided the goods and refused to comply. She was left destitute, a legal victor with nothing in hand. This created an unspoken rule. A dowry was not a promise, but a risk. And so, as the daughter of the Lavender Hills was prepared for her wedding, the chest at her feet was both gift and warning. Her mother pressed a thin silver coin into her hand, too small to matter, too symbolic to ignore, and whispered, "Hide it. Always keep one thing that is yours." Many mothers said the same. Across Aragon, in stone villages and hillside farms, mothers trained daughters to stitch small pouches into their undergarments or bind a copper ring into the hem of their shawl. These tokens were not for wealth, but for control. If a husband drank away the family estate, if a war took the crops, if a second wife arrived unannounced, the woman had something, however small, to hold that. It was, in essence, an inheritance, unofficial, unspoken, but real. There were outliers. Some wealthy Aragonese families, especially those connected to the crown or the church. Exceptional women emerged who manipulated dowry laws to their advantage. They wrote their own wills, invested in local monasteries, or managed estates on behalf of absentee sons. These were women like Teresa, Gil, de Vidor, who wielded influence as both consort and landholder during the reign of James I. But even her rights were questioned by royal advisors and undermined by legal maneuvers. For the average woman, the law said one thing, but lived reality said another. The dowry, for all its value, was a limit. It marked the end of her belonging to one world and her uncertain welcome into another. Once she crossed that line, her inheritance was no longer hers. It became part of a man's domain, her husband's, his brother's, even her own sons, someday. And if her womb bore daughters, not sons, the cycle began again. What did she feel then, on the night before her wedding, sitting by that cedar chest, fingering the brass latch? Was it hope? Was it shame? Was it simply preparation for a life she already understood too well? Years passed. The chest that once held her dowry now rested at the foot of a different bed, scratched and faded from decades of use. Its contents had changed, no longer combs or tunics, but children's garments, funeral cloth, and a handful of old contracts she could no longer bear to read. The ink had faded. The promises within had always been conditional. She had borne 3 children, 2 girls, then a boy. The boy came last, and with him, everything changed, not within the walls of her home, where she had always labored, always obeyed, but in the way her name was once again spoken aloud, Madre de Herido, Mother of the Air. The midwife had whispered it with reverence. Her husband had repeated it with relief. It was not that her daughters were unloved, but their existence had carried the weight of uncertainty. Their futures depended entirely on dowry, reputation, and marriage. And for years, her womb had been a quiet battlefield, not because anyone said so aloud, but because every harvest, every prayer, every whispered conversation between her husband and the notary carried the same anxious undercurrent. Would this family end with her? Now it would not. The law would pass through her son like water through a funnel, bypassing her entirely. The land she had managed while her husband traveled, land she had walked and known in every season, was never hers. The cattle she had nursed through plague, the granary she had personally overseen when trade routes were blocked, these things would not bear her name in the records, only her son's. She did not protest. She had known this since she was a girl. Her body, her work, her patience, all were part of the continuity of a name that did not include her. But she watched her daughters. She saw the same future forming beneath their feet. They, too, would receive chests, not land. They, too, would carry names that would not be recorded in any legal scrolls unless they filed complaints or caused scandal. A daughter's name entered the archive only in the margins. When something went wrong, it was not just custom. It was a design in the town square. Stone plaques recorded the gifts of noblemen to the cathedral. Merchants inscribed their family trees on 2 illuminated charters. Sons were counted. Lineages were traced. But if one looked closely in the shadowy corners of monastic ledgers and forgotten testament registries, a few women's names flickered. Often they were widows who outlived their husbands and temporarily managed estates. Occasionally were childless aunts who became guardians of their brothers' orphans. Their names survived not because they were wanted, but because they were useful, and still they endured. The woman of the Lavender Hills aged into a grandmother. She taught her daughters the rules of the hearth and the rhythm of the seasons. But she also taught them how to write their names in charcoal on the wall beneath the eaves, just once, when no one would look, so they would know that even if the law forgot them, they had not forgotten themselves. Her youngest daughter, the quietest one, began to record seed counts and rainfall in a corner of her prayer book. As she wrote carefully, wrapping the entries in prayers to saints no longer popular. She left space, always, in case someone wanted to read it later. Asterisk. She knew no one would, but it mattered to her anyway. In the monasteries, scribes continued to copy law codes and property registers. Women's names appeared briefly in clauses: wife of, mother of, widow of, but rarely as actors in their own right. Only once, in the margins of a parchment stored in the Episcopal Archive of Teruel. A scribe added a line in smaller handwriting, and she managed the fields as well as any man, though she held no title. No name was attached, no date, just a trace of recognition. Too late, too quiet. That was the truth of it. Inheritance was more than land or coins. It was memory. And a woman's memory in 13th century Aragon was a thing borrowed, not kept. And yet, she lingered. In recipes passed to 2 daughters. In prayers said by name, though not written. In walls mended, in stories whispered beside embers, in old chests carried from one wedding to the next. Sometimes the law does not tell the whole story. Sometimes the silence around a woman is not an absence, but a refusal, a waiting. What do we lose when we measure worth only in what is written, inherited, or owned? And what do we fail to inherit simply because no one thought to write it down? Asterisk. In the grand atrium of a Roman domus near the Palatine Hill, beneath painted ceilings and colonnaded courtyards, a small girl sat quietly on a wooden stool. Her linen tunic was clean but unadorned. Her hair was pinned up too tightly, her hands folded too neatly, and the silver tray before her carried no meats, no fruits, no wine, just a small piece of bread and a bowl of lentils, spiced lightly, not out of taste, but caution. She was the daughter of a senator. Her father wore a purple-bordered toga, discussed affairs of state with consuls, and was considered a man of immense dignitas. Her mother rarely left the upper floor of the house, except during religious festivals, and she, their daughter, was present, but largely unseen. She was known to guests only through nods and footfalls, a glimmer of white cloth passing behind. Marble thresholds in elite Roman families. Daughters were paradoxes. They were raised in luxury, but considered impermanent, protected, but peripheral. Every detail of their upbringing, from the angle of their seating posture to the order in which they spoke, was engineered for eventual transfer into another household. They were not raised to inherit, but to be inherited in public ceremonies. Her brothers were introduced with laurel crowns and speeches. Their birthdays were marked by sacrifices, feast days, and inscribed offerings. But for her, no triumphs were planned. Roman culture reserved loud celebrations for sons, for their future as magistrates, soldiers, or heads of households. Daughter's life began quietly, and, if lived correctly, ended even more so when a girl was born into a Roman elite household. She was named not as an individual, but as an extension of the family. If her father's gens was Cornelius, she became Cornelia. If he was Julius, she became Julia. No first name, no personal designation beyond a possessive suffix. Daughters were often further distinguished by numerical order: Julia Major, Julia Minor, Julia Tertia. Their identities were borrowed, plural, and collective. The household slaves called her Domina Parva, Little Mistress, and taught her the habits of quiet dignity. She learned to walk without sound, to greet her father's guest with a downward gaze. She was not to interrupt, not to laugh too loudly, not to express preference for music, philosophy, or dance unless invited, and rarely was she invited. The girl's education depended on her family's mood. In some noble houses, especially those touched by Hellenistic influence, girls were taught to read and write, to memorize lines of Virgil or fragments of Sappho, even to learn some Greek. But even then, this was not preparation for debate or authorship, it was to make her more appealing to a future husband with literary taste. Her worth would never be measured by her thoughts, only by her conduct. By the age of 6 or 7, she had already been told pudicitia, modesty, was her greatest virtue, not intelligence, not joy, not courage. Pudicitia meant silence. Chastity, obedience, was reinforced in every statue. She walked past stone women cloaked to the chin, eyes cast downward, mouths closed. Roman art did not celebrate female individuality. It modeled decorum, and yet, in the privacy of the women's quarters, the gymnasium, she sometimes found small freedoms. Her mother and the older house slaves told stories not found in Libby's histories. Tales of clever wives who manipulated politics behind curtains, of Vestal virgins who defied accusation, of mothers who guided their sons from shadows, never from seats. She listened carefully, but even there, the past was framed through obedience. A woman was remembered for her virtue in grief, not her joy. Livia, wife of Augustus, was revered not for her intellect, though she had plenty, but for her careful neutrality and her ability to remain above scandal. She was painted as the ideal Roman matron, powerful in her restraint. So the girl, Julia, perhaps, or Cornelia, was told that her future lay in restraint, the absence of her name from controversy, in the silence of her passage from one house to another. And yet, she was not insignificant. Every Roman elite household depended on the right marriages. Alliances were solidified not only through treaties, but through daughters. Fathers arranged unions for political gain, and in doing so, they entrusted their daughters with the most delicate of missions, to carry their name into another gens, to bear heirs, to maintain honor under pressure. Failure was not an option. If a daughter was divorced, it brought shame not always to her husband, but to her natal family. If she was infertile, she was pitied, sometimes quietly replaced. If she spoke too freely, her mother was blamed. If she was widowed young, she was expected to remarry quickly and with grace, no matter the grief. If she died in childbirth, she was buried with ceremony, but soon forgotten. Still, some resisted the quiet, in scattered funerary inscriptions. We find personal echoes. One tomb reads, "To Julia, who sang, even when not asked." Another, Cornelia, who advised her brother and was loved by her slaves. These are rare. They do not reflect norm, but exception. But they proved something was felt, that daughters, even marble ones, had hearts that beat outside protocol. The girl who sat alone at the wooden stool, dipping bread into lentils, would grow. She would marry. She would give birth. She would disappear from the record unless something extraordinary occurred, a scandal, a martyrdom, or a rebellion. But even if her name faded, she would remember the days spent watching her brothers learn rhetoric while she embroidered laurel patterns. She would remember the feel of her mother's hand tightening the girdle around her waist before a betrothal ceremony. She would remember the silence that greeted her first bleeding, the noise that followed the birth of a son hers. At last, what would that feel like? To be born into a world where your every moment is designed for someone else's gain. To walk hallways of marble, your feet leaving no mark. And when the statues are gone and the records buried, who will remember the girl who ate alone? By the age of 12, the girl had been promised. Not officially, the legal documents had not yet been drawn, and her future husband's name was still spoken cautiously, as if invoking him too often might make the deal unravel. Everyone in the household knew, the glances from her mother, the sudden shift in how the steward addressed her, the arrival of a private tutor for rhetoric not meant to be recited aloud. These were signs in the Roman Republic. And later, the empire, a girl could be betrothed as early as 7 and married by 12. These were not exceptions, but expectations. especially among the elite. While marriage age laws allowed for some variance, cultural pressure to secure advantageous alliances often outpaced legal restraint. For the girl, marriage was not the beginning of personal freedom. It was the start of permanent observation. Dowry was already being calculated, not by her, but by men seated around polished tables, sipping watered wine and arguing over grain prices. It would be sizable enough to maintain appearances, but not so large as to overshadow her husband's holdings. It was a negotiation between male heads of households, and she was the token exchanged. Her body was the carrier of political potential. In every Roman elite marriage, the woman's fertility was a strategic asset. The hope, the expectation was that she would bear sons to cement the union. A daughter's success, then, was measured not in her personality, intellect, or preferences, but in her ability to conceive and deliver heirs. And if she did not, the answer was usually quiet. Roman marriage law made it relatively easy for a husband to initiate divorce. He did not need to prove fault. He could simply send his wife back to her father's home. Reasons varied: barrenness, scandal, political repositioning, or mere inconvenience. The wife had little recourse unless she held exceptional status or backing from her natal family. A divorced daughter became an embarrassment, not necessarily for herself, though society often implied moral failing, but for the father who arranged the match. She returned childless or publicly humiliated. She was a visible crack in the household's facade. Some fathers tried again, offering her in a second marriage with an adjusted dowry. Others quietly sent her to a rural villa to rest and live out her days under distant supervision. Rarely was she asked what she wanted. This pressure created a life lived under intense internal control. From adolescence onward, daughters were trained to regulate posture, speech, appetite, tone, and facial expression. The wrong gesture at a feast could become gossip. The wrong pause during a priestly rite could be interpreted as disrespect, and gossip among slaves, clients, neighbors flowed like water in the domus. Nothing remained private. Some Roman girls fought this. Letters discovered in the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum include graffiti attributed to young women mocking potential suitors, expressing boredom with religious duties, or even praising female friends over male relatives. These marks, scratched into plastered walls, are among the few places where elite girls left their unfiltered voices, but most left no trace. Marriage also marked a shift in legal identity. Upon marrying, a woman underwent manus transferring from her father's authority to her husband's. Not all marriages followed this form strictly, especially as Roman law evolved in the imperial period. Some women retained financial ties to their birth families, but socially, the message was clear. A daughter, once married, belonged to another house. Her name did not follow her. She remained Julia or Cornelia or Claudia, an extension of her father's gens, now folded into her husband's. If her new family already had a Julia, she became the younger one or the other one. Her individuality, never formally recorded, was further diluted inside her new home. She would oversee the domas, organizing servants, managing food stores, preparing for festivals. But these duties carried no title, no office, only the expectation that all would run smoothly and invisibly. And if she succeeded, her reward was stability. If she failed, silence again, but of a different kind. There were women who carved out shadows of influence. The mother of the Gracchi brothers, Cornelia, famously remained unmarried after her husband's death and shaped her sons' political careers with strategic elegance. She became a symbol of Roman virtue, but even her fame was couched in relation to the men she bore. Still, her name endured because she was the mother of tribunes, not for what she did, but for whom she birthed. Back in the domus, near the Palatine, the daughter's wedding approached. She was fitted for a stola, a long pleated dress worn by married women, symbolizing honor and fidelity. Her veil was flame-colored, and her shoes were painted the same, recalling ancient traditions of brides as torchbearers into the home. These rituals were ancient and deeply theatrical, yet beneath the costume, she remained a girl whose childhood had passed in quiet corners, whose voice had been trained in whispers, and whose future now rested in the hands of men discussing treaties. Over olives and oil would her name be remembered if she bore no sons. If she died in childbirth, would her tombstone carry even her age? Or would she, too, become one more Julia in the list, unnumbered and unloved by the record? Asterisk, the wedding passed as expected, with all the proper omens, the public procession, the exchange of hands, dextre my young Chio, between girl and man beneath watching gods and layered customs. The guests drank honeyed wine, the house gods received a small offering, and the child's bride was escorted to her new home in silence, holding the keys to a household that would never truly be hers. For a time, she thrived, or at least, she endured. She kept the linens counted and clean. She managed the kitchen stores, maintained the shrine in the atrium, bore a child by her second year of marriage. A boy. There was celebration then, not for her, but for the bloodline. The father's friends sent gifts. Own role, though praised, was already being refocused toward her son's future. She was no longer simply a daughter or a bride. She was now a mater familias, a title that held both respect and invisibility. As mother of a Roman citizen, she gained symbolic stature. Yet she became less of a person, more of a function. No bust would be sculpted in her image. No scrolls would be penned in her voice. Even in household inscriptions, she would be listed merely as Uxor, wife of a senator, a magistrate, or some nobleman who had once read Cicero by lamplight and now barked orders in the forum. And when she bore a daughter, her second child, there was no feast, no lustration ceremony with musicians, just the basic rites performed with quiet efficiency. The girl, like her mother before her, would be dressed in a simple tunic and fed at a separate table. She would grow beneath the same ceilings, learn the same restraint, and be prepared for the same exchange. Another soft repetition of a pattern that had carved Roman society into silent lines of marble daughters and thunderous bronze sons. Outside, the empire expanded. Soldiers marched through Gaul. Roads stretched into Britannia. Grain ships left the harbors of Egypt, but within the domus, the rhythm was unchanged. The governance of daughters remained a private empire of shadowed decisions and unrecorded labors. It's worth asking what happened when these women grew old. Some did live into old age, especially those who bore sons who survived. Elderly Roman woman, if respected, might be honored with a domestic shrine or spoken of in a son's oration. But the stories told were almost always about her virtue, her silence, her obedience, her piety, her ability to suffer without complaint. Rarely was she remembered for her mind, or her desires, or her innovations, if she healed her children with herbs, or counseled her husband in matters of business. These things were folded into the greater story of his greatness, not hers. Even in death, she was framed through the men around her on funerary inscriptions. You find endless variations of the Claudia, the most obedient wife. She bore 3 sons, managed the home with grace, and never caused her husband shame. This was the height of honor for most elite Roman daughters. But sometimes, just sometimes, a different kind of name survived. Archaeologists in Ostia uncovered a small marble slab belonging to a woman named Aemilia Lupa. Not a noble, not a known poet. She had lived in the house of a minor merchant. But the inscription, clearly carved by someone who loved her, reads, "She made the bread every day with her own hands and never forgot the names of the sea-wans." That's all. A memory preserved, not for glory, not for empire, but for presence, for being. Such memories rarely survived in the official record, but they lingered in family stories, in scratched names behind villa walls, in half-year-ace graffiti near the women's baths. These were the informal inscriptions of a society that formally forgot its daughters. Back in the Palatine villa, the girl, now a mother, perhaps now a widow, walked the same halls where she once ate alone. Her feet made no more sound than they had in youth. Her hands, once small and cautious, now bore the marks of care and constancy. She had raised children, buried kin, upheld the rituals of dozens of festivals, and kept the household from fraying in times of war and plague. But her name would not be entered into the Senate records. Her likeness would not be minted. On coinage, her letters, if she had dared to write them, would be lost or burned. Still, she had lived, and though no trumpets ever heralded her arrival into the world, though no poets sang of her cleverness or quiet defiance, she had marked the earth, softly, repeatedly, through generations of meals served, wounds mended, names whispered, into the ears of sons who would one day speak loudly in the forum. History does not record how she died, perhaps in childbirth, perhaps quietly in her sleep, perhaps during one of the endless Roman fevers that passed from villa to villa like wind, and yet, someone remembered, a servant, perhaps, or a grown daughter with children of her own, someone who said her name aloud after others had forgotten it, not in marble, not in ink, but into the silence of an evening courtyard. What happens to a civilization when it forgets its daughters? And what might be rediscovered if you read between the lines they were never allowed to write? Asterisks, in the year 1571, in the cool morning shadow of Fatihur Sikri, the imperial city, built by Emperor Akbar, a revenue officer, dipped his pen into dark, black ink and recorded the household data of a nearby village. The register was neat. The language was Persian. The format borrowed from ancient Indo-Islamic tradition, and the style unmistakably imperial numerical precision. Structured columns, taxable heads of household, planned productivity, and male offspring. Male offspring, not children, not daughters, only sons. He noted the size of cultivated land, the taxes due, the types of grains grown, and then, in a narrow margin beside a family's name, one son, age 10, 2 bullocks, 1 adult male laborer, wife not counted, and there was no space in the Ain-i-Akbari, the administrative document that governed Akbar's revenue system, for the quiet detail of a girl's existence. Asterisk. If she was born, she did not appear in the ledger. If she died, she vanished without revision. She was not invisible in the family courtyard. Of course, she was real, deeply real. She hauled water in copper pots from the communal well, soaked lentils in clay bowls, and plucked lice from her younger brother's scalp while her mother mended cotton cloth. She had a name, perhaps Ruxana, Mira, or something whispered by the grandmother who first held her. But that name was not carved into any family seal or inked into any legal document. In Mughal India, especially during Akbar's reign, administrative records became vastly more complex and refined. Landholding classifications were standardized. A central bureaucracy emerged. The detailed revenue manuals were drawn up, but all from the perspective of production, taxation, and military service. And those categories had no room for daughters, because daughters did not till land. Daughters did not pay tax. Daughters were not considered potential warriors or heads of household. And so, in the most sophisticated bureaucratic empire South Asia had ever known, half the population remained absent from the state's gaze. That absence wasn't only bureaucratic. It shaped how value was assigned, who was protected, who was invested in, and who was seen as dispensable. In rural households, a daughter was still precious, emotionally, spiritually, but economically, She was a liability. Her birth was accompanied not by celebration, but by calculation. Would there be enough for her dowry? Would she live long enough to marry? Would her marriage provoke a debt that lingered for decades? In some regions, when a girl was born, mothers would quietly place a pinch of turmeric near the threshold, not as a marker of joy, but as a talisman of protection. Some midwives avoided announcing the birth at all. The father might hear the child's first cry, and simply retreat into silence. There was no tradition of counting girls in formal census unless something unusual occurred. A girl born to a noble house, or one who entered a Sufi, Kancha, or royal Zanana. Even then, her record was often framed through the male figures around her: daughter of betrothed to, wife of, in a small village near Lahore. One tax record from 1593 makes passing mention of a girl who had disappeared, likely eloped or escaped in arranged marriage. The note was scrawled in haste. Side comment by a local officer, frustrated that the family had refused to pay the agreed bridal sum. The girl's name was not listed, only her disruption, because to be a daughter in that era was to exist fully within the household, but not within the world outside it. And yet, they endured. Millions of them. They swept courtyards, folded cloth, whispered lullabies, broidered names they could not speak aloud, and memorized songs never written down. They learned the rhythms of cooking, the tempo of hand-washing dishes, the specific hour when the village sun struck the edge of the mango tree, and it was time to fetch water again. Sometimes, a girl would sing when no one was listening. She would imitate the muezzin or recite the lines of Bhakti poets she overheard the men discussing. If caught, she'd smile shyly and return to her work. Some families valued their daughters deeply in private. Some fathers recited verses about their daughter's beauty, their skill with grain, their gentle hands. But in the world of officialdom, the world of taxes, scrolls, and law, these feelings could not be measured, and so they disappeared into margins or never appeared at all. What effect does that kind of absence have on a society? What happens when half a population is born, grows, suffers, and dies without ever being counted? Asterisk, the pot weighed more than she did. It was brass, worn smooth from years of rinsing, and it scraped against her side as she balanced it against her hip. Her feet, darkened with ash and dust, pressed quietly into the sun-warmed earth as she walked the narrow path from the family courtyard to the well at the village edge. She was 8 years old. Her name was not in the census, not in the village tax record, not in the revenue logs kept by the Mughal scribes, who visited once each year on their horses with scrolls and seals. But every day, her work was counted by those who depended on her, just not in ink. She brought water. She stirred lentils. She knew when to wake the goats and when to hide when her father's voice grew too sharp in the afternoon heat. She wasn't yet considered old enough to be married, but she already knew it was coming. In the Mughal tax system under Akbar, much attention was paid to the production of land, the output of labor, and the extraction of revenue. It was a system designed with astonishing precision. The Zabt method categorized crops, calculated yields, and assigned tax accordingly, based on the bigger of land and average output over a decade. And yet, nowhere in these documents were girls acknowledged, even as they labored every day. Not in the official grain stores they swept, not in the meals they prepared to sustain. It's the very workers who were taxed, not in the rituals they performed at village shrines, tying threads to Niami branches, offering rice to the goddesses, praying not for sons, but for peace. They existed outside the economy, even as they held it together. Daughters, especially in rural Mughal India, were seen through the lens of the household economy, a private, domestic sphere that was never counted publicly, but shaped everything. A daughter could weave. A daughter could stitch. A daughter could manage grain, prepare pickles, knead flat bread, remember which guest took sweet or salt, all from memory. But none of that was seen as taxable labor. None of that registered as value on a scroll. Still, her worth was always calculated in dowry negotiations, in whispered conversations about marriage, age, and the family's choice of how many bangles to save or cows to breed. Her future shaped the financial planning of everyone around her. If she had sisters, the burden multiplied in some regions, especially in parts of Punjab and Rajasthan. Tax collectors took note of families with too many daughters, not to help them, but to keep an eye on debts. A family with 4 daughters and no sons might be flagged as a poor risk, more likely to fall behind on grain quotas or to default on cash payments. So, while daughters were not officially counted, their presence changed everything. And because of this, many families felt deep ambivalence. Joy at a girl's birth, quickly swallowed by dread. Love, tempered by financial fear. A girl too beautiful might require an expensive wedding. A girl too clever might stir questions. A girl too many was a liability. The language of some tax records reflected this tension. In rare comments scribbled in margins, one finds phrases like household, unstable, 2 daughters of age, solvent, due to daughter's match in neighboring district, remains unpaid, no sons. Nowhere was the girl blamed directly, but she was never fully seen either. And yet, they shaped the village more than anyone admitted. It was daughters who kept track of feasts and fasts, who reminded fathers of debts owed, or herbs to be ground, or elders to be visited. It was daughters who gathered cow dung for fuel, swept courtyards with neem branches, and sang songs that helped neighbors tell the time of day. In the oral traditions of the period Brahmas, wedding, laments, harvest songs, daughters appear more often than in any tax document. They are the ones who carry family grief, who remember what was lost in floods, who recount where each neighbor buried their best lentil harvest. The official records missed them, but the songs never did. And in the long silence of history, it is often the songs that remain when scrolls have crumbled. Still, those songs were sung inside courtyards, not in the courts. The empire heard only what it measured, and it measured men, grain, silver, and land, not girls. So she carried the brass pot day after day without complaint. When she was 10, she helped her mother hide a stash of lentils behind a broken section of the wall. When she was 12, she was betrothed. No ink was spilled to document her arrival or departure. Only a handful of jasmine petals were tossed quietly at her feet when she left. Why did the empire, so precise in its numbers, have no number for her? And what kind of power grows in a population that's never seen but never stops working? Asterisk. She was 14 when she left her home, her body painted with turmeric and her arms stacked with glass bangles that clicked like quiet warnings as she walked. Her mother wept, though not in front of her. The neighbors whispered blessings. The village priest mumbled the same ritual words he'd used for every wedding in the last 30 years. There was no official record of the marriage, no state-recognized document. No tax ledger was updated, no census line altered. She simply disappeared from her father's household and appeared, silently, in another man's courtyard. Her name still wasn't written. This was how it worked, not by accident, but by design. The Mughal administrative system, so advanced for its time, counted crops in decimal accuracy. It charted rainfall in select provinces, cataloged types of land from black cotton soil to sandy loam, hand-described revenue in exact dams and muhars of silver. But the girl who ground those grains, who scrubbed the stone on which spices were crushed, who sang lullabies that kept the family awake through a hard harvest, she existed entirely outside the empire's view. Asterisk. Even after Akbar's sweeping reforms, which sought to unify law under a syncretic system blending Sharia, Hindu customs, and imperial order, there remained no mechanism to account for the labor of girls and women. they could be affected by laws through arranged marriages, restrictions on movement, or expectations of piety. But they had no hand in shaping them, not in writing, not in ink. In some noble households, a few elite women were visible, queens, concubines, and consorts, whose lives brushed against policy. Akbar's own court included formidable women like his mother, Hamida Banu Begum, and his aunt, Gulbadan Begum, who wrote memoirs and advised on courtly affairs. But even their power was limited to personal influence, not legal structure. For the average girl, there was only service, invisible, uncounted, and uninterrupted. She became a wife. Then, 1 year later, a mother. The birth was hard. A neighbor midwife used butter and neem oil, whispered invocations of Satala, and promised to bring the child safely into the world. It was a girl. No official registered the birth. No entry was made in any ledger. The baby was named after a grandmother, perhaps, swaddled in old cloth, nursed in the shade of the cooking shelter. The house continued. Another generation formed, yet the system remained blind. Even death did not change this. When the mother died 5 years later from fever, there was no burial fee, no official mourning, only a quiet pyre near the riverbank. A niece sprinkled camphor. The husband returned home and prepared to remarry. The girl's name vanished as if it had never been spoken, and still, the records continued. The tax collectors came every year. They counted the male heads of household. They noted the tools, the land, the sons born since the last cycle. They revised the revenue obligation. They accepted bribes or added fines. And then they left satisfied that the village was in order. Yet, for every son counted, 2 daughters were likely ignored. Their labor went unpaid. The bodies went unprotected. Their ideas went unwritten, but they endured. Some of them ran small cloth exchanges from inside their courtyards, bartering old garments for grains. Some taught children how to read prayers phonetically. Some memorized dozens of medicinal plants, passing knowledge hand to hand when sickness spread and no hakim could be found. And some resisted in quiet ways. A girl who stole time to write her name in charcoal behind a water pot. A mother who demanded her daughter marry at 15 instead of 12. A widow who kept her husband's ring buried under a name tree, refusing to speak his name. None of this was recorded. None of it survived on paper, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. What we know of Mughal India comes from the archives, the Ain-i-Akbari, the Baburnama, court historians, land surveys, scrolls written in Persian and Sanskrit. They tell us about kings, taxes, battles, crops, temples, mosques, monuments, architecture. But they do not tell us about the girl who bled through her clothes. It's the first time and didn't know why. Or the woman who taught her granddaughters to sing lullabies in secret, even when the village outlawed women's songs after a famine. Or the mother who gave her only silver coin to her daughter and told her, "Bury this where the taxmen won't find it." These lives were erased before they were even acknowledged, and yet they shaped the soil. The work they did, unseen, unrecognized, kept villages alive, held households together, and passed culture through generations without ever being named. What kind of history do we have if we only count those who could pay? And how many empires rose on the shoulders of people who are never counted? Asterisk, in the spring of 1488, in the sun-warmed city of Florence, a notary tipped his quill into black ink and carefully began the process of calculating a dowry. The parchment before him was lined with spaces for silverweight, land deeds, and linen valuations. But nowhere was there room for the girl's voice. Her name was Antonia. She was 16. Her father was a wool merchant, not the wealthiest in the district, but established enough to own a house with a small courtyard and a tiled roof that did not leak. Her mother had already packed away a chest of embroidered undergarments, a prayer book, and a velvet dress dyed with crushed cochineal beetles. The dowry chest would soon be locked, sealed, and sent with her to a home she had never seen. To be a daughter in Renaissance Italy was to be prepared for a transaction. In theory, dowries were gifts, a benevolent tradition meant to help the bride begin her new life. In practice, they were debts, carefully weighed against a family's reputation, resources, and anxieties. The entire city was shaped by them. Florence's tax records, guild ledgers, and marriage contracts all revolved around the dowry economy. The richer the family, the higher the expectation. A girl born into wealth was not liberated by it. She was bound by it. A large dowry was her ticket to a noble name. A small one limited her to merchants or widowers. A non-existent one meant she might never marry at all. The Monte del Dodi. The Florentine Dowry Fund was established to help manage this burden. Fathers could pay into it at their daughter's birth, investing over time so that her dowry would grow by the time she was of age. It was one of the earliest examples of state-managed endowment schemes, and its records are filled with the names of girls who would never sign a legal. Titania's name was likely there, not written by her hand, but by her father's 15 years earlier. On a morning when the wool market had surged and he dared to imagine a noble match. Now the match was made. Her fiancé Giuliano was 28, a notary himself, with connections to the city council and a long family history of cautious upward movement. His father had negotiated well, 450 florins in silver, one small vineyard in San Castiano, and a bundle of fine linens. Giuliano's own household brought a modest inheritance, but what he gained in this marriage was not merely silver. It was prestige, a connection to the merchant class. A girl trained in restraint and obedience. Antonia had been raised for this. She knew how to fold her hands properly during Mass. She had memorized prayers in Latin. She could embroider in 4 styles, prepare almond milk, and recite select verses from Dante's Divine Comedy. She had been warned, more than once, to avoid laughter that lasted too long, but no one had asked if she wanted to marry Giuliano. Her body was considered part of the dowry, an extension of the wealth being transferred. Her virginity was noted as a fact, not a question. Her ability to produce heirs was assumed, and yet her dowry contract, like nearly all others, came with no guarantees for her if she died before bearing children. The dowry could revert to her husband's family. If she was widowed, she might recover a portion, but only through legal petitions. If the marriage collapsed, her fate would depend entirely on her male relatives, both natal and marital, and their willingness to speak on her behalf. In elite circles, dowries reached extraordinary heights. Noble girls brought sums exceeding 3,000 florins, along with paintings, land holdings, and rare books. These marriages were less about affection than alliance. Banking dynasties and aristocratic families fused through the dowries of daughters, who often barely knew the men they married. But even in modest homes, the pressure was immense. Poorer families sometimes placed multiple daughters in convents simply because they could not afford multiple dowries. These were not always acts of devotion. They were economic triage. A girl in a convent cost less than a wedding, and if she became a nun, her family preserved its assets. Antonia had avoided that fate. For now, on the day of her wedding, her dowry chest was placed on a small wooden cart. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in expectation. Sided were the goods that would define her role in her new home: silk veils, brass cooking pots, a copy of the Book of the Courtier annotated by her mother. These were her tools, not of power, but of permanence. Once married, she would have few rights to speak of. Dowry became the property of her husband, though legally earmarked for her support. In practice, it meant little. If he squandered it, she could appeal to a magistrate, but only if she had surviving male relatives to advocate for her. And if he died, she might gain some freedom as a widow. She could manage property, sign contracts, even run a household independently, but only after years of silence. Years of being seen but rarely heard. So when Antonia crossed the city that morning, her veil fluttering in the wind, she knew she was stepping into a life that had been charted for her long before she learned how to read. She smiled, she bowed, she thanked the priest, and no one asked how it felt to carry one's entire worth in a box made by another man's hands. Was it dowry protection, a gift, a burden, or was it simply the price of being born a daughter? Starisk, in her new home, Antonia learned quickly that her dowry was both armor and chain. On her first evening in Giuliano's house, a narrow structure with high ceilings and thick wooden shutters, she was introduced to the household ledgers. Her husband, a methodical man, kept records of every coin, bolt of cloth, and kitchen ladle. Her dowry was entered neatly on the second page of his new ledger, just beneath the heading, Assets brought into the Union, March 1488, asterisk. She scanned the list, her vineyard, the linens, the florins. Her name appeared nowhere. The chest that had once been hers was now part of the household property, Giuliano's property. She was, in the eyes of law and practice, a component of the transfer. It was not a cruel home, nor a cruel marriage. Giuliano spoke gently, rarely raised his voice. He allowed her to keep a servant girl from her father's house. He tolerated her fondness for reading, so long as the books were pious and the time well managed. But the truth of her status was never in question. Her value had already been quantified. In Renaissance Italy, the dowry was not just a family arrangement. It was a legal construct, supported by notaries, protected in theory by courts, and constantly watched by extended families. Should anything go wrong, if Antonia failed to produce a child, if Giuliano's business faltered, her dowry would become the site of dispute, a battlefield of obligation. This was common. Courts in Florence, Venice, and Siena routinely heard cases involving dowry mismanagement. A husband might gamble away his wife's dowry and then hide behind legal delays. A widow might try to reclaim what was rightfully hers, only to discover it had been absorbed into debts or quietly passed to a cousin. Entire estates were divided over the contents of one chest. Antonia began to feel it, the weight of that box, long after its contents had been unpacked. It sat at the end of her bed, now used for spare linens, but she could not touch it without remembering what it represented. Her father's sacrifice, her husband's ledger, her lack of choice. She heard stories in the marketplace, among whispers shared by other women during feast preparations or while waiting in line at the bakery. One girl's husband had lost her, dowry investing in a sea voyage to Flanders, He died of fever, and her in-laws refused to return anything. Another woman, childless after 10 years, was pressured to relinquish her portion early to help settle her husband's debts. When she refused, she was accused of poisoning his mother. Even among noble families, dowries became weapons. In Venice, entire bloodlines were defined by their ability to bring large dowries into aristocratic houses. And when the dowry was threatened, by war, by bad luck, by scandal, the woman was always the one left holding the shame to preserve what little control they had. Women developed strategies. Some managed secret accounts, hiding coins within folded gowns. Others stitched messages into their linens, not for rebellion, but for memory, date, a name, a prayer for protection. Antonia kept a small notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the window. It wasn't legal. Women weren't expected to keep records. That was the realm of their husbands and notaries. But she wrote anyway, not in protest, but in preservation. Notes about what she spent on kitchen herbs. Notes about how much flour was delivered and when. Notes about what her mother had said about vinegar keeping ants away. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a history no one else would write. Over time, her marriage settled into routine. Giuliano left at dawn for the notary's bench. She oversaw the baking, the linen washing, the visits to the church of Santa Croce. She bore one son, then another. Both survived infancy, which was rare and celebrated. Neighbors congratulated Giuliano on his fortune. No one thanked her. Her dowry had served its purpose, and yet she remained responsible for it, emotionally, practically, and socially. If the family suffered, her dowry would be re-examined. If her sons inherited less than they expected, they might blame the contract written before they were born. She would carry that burden in silence, in old age, if she lived long enough to outlast her husband. She might have the chance to reclaim part of the dowry. Widows were often granted a portion for their upkeep, especially if they had sons to support them. But they still had to petition. They still had to justify their claim. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if she'd had no dowry, no chest, no vineyard, no embroidered linens. Would Giuliano have married her? Would anyone? Could she have chosen differently? In the alleyways of Florence, outside the view of records and contracts, women told quieter stories of marriages without dowry, often born of love, but cursed by poverty, of girls hidden in convents to escape forced arrangements, of old women who had burned their dowry chests after becoming widows, not out of rage, but relief. Perhaps those women had understood something the rest had not. A dowry could be a bridge, yes, but it could also be a cage. And for every girl like Antonia, whose name appeared only in the margins of a ledger, there remained a question. What would it look like if a woman's worth were measured not in florins or fields, but in the life she built from silence? Antonia was 52 when Giuliano died. He had developed a cough during a humid spring. It was one of those slow, persistent illnesses that crept in behind the ribs and never fully left. The physicians came with their jars of vinegar and clove, their prayers and diagnoses. Nothing helped. One morning, after a sleepless night, he was gone, for the first time in decades. Antonia was alone in her own house. The silence was heavy, but it brought something unexpected space. Her sons, now grown and married, had already taken over the management of Giuliano's accounts. Her role in the family, though smaller in daily duties, had grown in something subtler. She was now a widow, a status with its own kind of power in Renaissance Italy. Widowhood offered women more legal standing than marriage ever did. A widow could manage property, speak in court, and petition for the return of her dowry. She was no longer expected to be silent, though many still were, out of caution, fear, or habit. Antonia's dowry had not vanished. Giuliano, methodical as always, had protected a portion of it in accordance with Florentine custom. But to reclaim it, Antonia had to act. She had to petition the magistrate for formal release of the remaining funds and land. And to do that, she had to be visible, recorded talk for the first time in her life. Antonia's name appeared in a legal document as the petitioner, not the subject of a transaction between men. She signed her name with a slow, practiced hand, slightly shaky but firm. A clerk raised an eyebrow, impressed. That single signature may have been the only mark she ever made that would remain in the city's archives. She used the returned portion of her dowry to secure her place in the household of her younger son. She no longer swept the floors herself or prepared the lentil soup, but she continued to manage quietly from the background. Her granddaughters visited her often, asking about herbs and dye mixtures. She began teaching them what she had never been asked to teach before: how to keep a ledger. Not the kind her husband had kept neat, numbered, legal. A different kind, a history of recipes, market prices, dowry tricks, and secrets sewn into wedding veils. She taught them to look not at the numbers alone, but at the stories buried between florins and vines. This was her legacy. Not her vineyard, not her chest, not even her sons, though she loved them. It It was this transmission of knowledge that no one thought to name, the wisdom of women, managing within systems that never truly belonged to them. She lived to see her great-granddaughter married. The dowry was higher this time. Inflation had crept across the Florentine hills, and girls were still being measured by the weight of their silver and the color of their velvet. But the chest the girl carried was different. Hidden in a secret compartment was a small book, bound in fabric, hand-sewn with Antonia's notes inside. Not just lists, but thoughts. You are worth more than this silver, but this silver will protect you, so guard it carefully. The notary will not ask what you want. Decide beforehand. Always hide one coin. Always remember one song. Antonia died at 71. She was buried quietly, without marble, beneath the chapel floor in her son's parish. Name was recorded in the church death register, misspelled slightly, her birth date unknown, but her book remained passed down. Not officially, not in libraries, not in state records, but through hands and homes and women who learned to read, not just what was written, but what was left out. And so the dowry that once confined her became something else, a record of survival, a reflection of value that the state never measured, because for every girl whose dowry was weighed in Florence, there was a woman who remembered which herbs to pack for childbirth, which merchant cheated on dye weight, and which neighbor would help when no one else would. The dowry chest, once closed with iron hinges, was opened again and again, not for coin, but for history. And what does it mean? Truly, the most enduring parts of a life are not those written in ledges, but whispered through generations. Asterisk, you're walking up the muddy path of a rural Japanese village sometime in the early 17th century. It's spring, technically, but the trees are still bare. The air is not warm. The thatched roofs are heavy with soot from long, relentless nights of firewood burning low and bellies gnawing at themselves. There's a silence in the village, not from peace, but from preservation, a quietness bred from hunger, where even breath feels rationed. This is not a war-torn land. It's not plague-ridden or cursed. It's just a bad harvest year. But that, in feudal Japan, was enough to begin the slow unraveling of a season that would separate who would eat and who would only watch. Asterisk. Every famine begins before the fields are empty in this particular village, perched on the edges of mountainous Echigo province. The trouble began months earlier. Late rains, then early frost. The rice plants, sacred and fragile, gave in. Stores from the last harvest were already thin, and without enough rice, not only were meals threatened, so were taxes, because even in the hungriest of times, rice was owed to the daimyo. A portion of every harvest, no matter how small, was designated as tribute. Non-payment was not simply a matter of fines or warnings. It could be interpreted as disloyalty. In some provinces, it was considered treason. The village headman knew what that meant. He sent messengers with what little rice could be spared. Then, the rest had to be divided, and that's where the real suffering began. Women were the last to eat, not always by law, not always by decree, but by something just as powerful, custom. In these rural hamlets, meals followed strict hierarchies. The eldest men, particularly those in leadership roles, ate first. Then younger men, followed by boys. Women came next, with girls at the end, in times of plenty. This ritual was often unremarkable, a quiet deference built into the rhythms of mealtime. But when rice was scarce, it became deadly. A pot of rice could no longer stretch through the household, and so, in a room with mats and bowls, the women would lower their eyes and slide their hands away from the grain. The first sign of hunger was subtle. A mother pretending to be full, a grandmother saying she had already eaten, a sister waiting for her brother to finish before she touched her bowl, then quietly passing it to the youngest girl. It wasn't just about politeness. It was a strategy, an attempt to make the food stretch further, to protect those most valued by society. Male children were seen as future workers. Women were caretakers, replaceable in numbers, dispensable when desperate. And in famine, calculations grow cruel. Households began doing what they had always done in quiet sacrifice. But as the days stretched into weeks, quiet sacrifice turned into skeletal silence. In one surviving account from the Shinano region, a Buddhist monk passing through a famine-hit hamlet recorded the behavior he witnessed in the women of the village. He noted that some women pretended to go foraging to avoid the shame of eating in front of hungry children. Others made leaf porridge, boiling twigs and grass to give the illusion of fullness to those around them. Still others began leaving at dawn, walking into the woods, not to gather food, but to die out of sight. They called it ubesut, a word that would later grow into legend, though debated among historians. The term referred to the abandonment of elderly women on remote mountains during times of extreme famine. Some tales are almost mythic in nature, suggesting ritual sacrifice or willing departure. Others are more grounded, describing it simply as an act of desperation by families with too many mouths to feed and too little left to give. Whether it happened in this village is uncertain. The records are sparse. Oral histories suggest it did. A few elderly women reportedly vanished during the worst of the year. One family claimed their grandmother had gone to visit a cousin and never returned. No cousin existed, but even outside the extreme, the daily deprivations tell their own story. Women lost more weight, fell ill faster, recovered slower, and still they cooked. The hearth fire never fully went out, even when it was only used to boil water flavored with bark. Women would rise before the men, sweep the floor, arrange the empty bowls, and keep up the appearance of order, as if ritual itself could hold back collapse. One of the daughters, Yuki, 13, and thin as a stalk of bamboo, began collecting pebbles. She placed them in a small jar beside the family's cooking pit. For every bowl of rice she didn't eat, she added one stone. When her mother found the jar, it was nearly full. She didn't ask why. She only wept. What does it mean then, when survival becomes a matter not of strength, but of silence? And when history forgets who fed whom, and who did not eat at all? Asterix, the famine did not end quickly. In feudal Japan, time often stretched in hard, dry loops, one failed harvest slipping silently into the next. And during these silent famines, when no battles were fought and no banners unfurled, the suffering remained behind closed doors, thin mud walls, and beneath smoke-stained rafters. You return to that same village in Akigo province. The year has worn thinner. The sky holds the look of late summer, but the earth is pale with thirst. Cracks split the dry rice paddies where water once shimmered. The scent of boiled grass now hangs more commonly in the air than the warmth of miso or grain dotting through it all. The women remain, carrying on. Those who survived the first wave of hunger now walked with bones more visible than flesh. Their roles did not shift, even in extreme scarcity. Daily chores continued. Women gathered firewood. They swept earthen floors. They kept the cooking pits warm, even when there was nothing to cook but twigs, radish tops, and sometimes ash mixed with water, sometimes flavored with crushed bitter leaves, became a staple for the poorest households. Not to provide nutrition, but to trick the belly into believing it had been fed. One record from a nearby province even mentions the boiling of dirt to create a sludge that could be swallowed. In some homes, mothers began shadow meals. These were not real meals, but rituals mimicking the act of eating. A bowl would be placed, hands would be folded in prayer, and the motions of lifting a non-existent spoon to the mouth would proceed in silence. To the gods, it was a form of devotion. To the children, a comforting illusion, but the hierarchy of eating, that rigid ladder of worth, remained. Sada, a woman of about 40, still walked from house to house in the mornings. She'd once been a midwife, and she still held that role, but the babies had mostly stopped coming. Birth rates dropped sharply during famine, not because of choice, but because of condition. Women's bodies, underfed and overstressed, simply ceased ovulating, and when a child was born, it was no longer greeted with joy. A girl's birth, especially, was more often met with averted eyes. Sada witnessed it firsthand. In one house, she helped a young mother deliver a daughter with thin black hair and a faint, mewling cry. But, instead of celebration, the father turned his back. "Don't tell the neighbors," he said. "We have no rights for shame." That was how some began to see girls, not as daughters, but as burdens carried in the womb too long, not because they lacked value entirely, but because in a land built on back-breaking labor, their value would not arrive for many years, and only if they survived. So, when rice was measured, it was measured with foresight. Could this child one day carry timber? Could she be wed to a household with food? Could she be sold? And if not, she might be announced with silence, or not announced at all. There is a term in historical Japanese documents, mabiki, taken from agriculture. It means thinning the seedlings, a process by which weaker sprouts are pulled, so the stronger ones might grow. In the context of famine, it became a chilling euphemism for infanticide, particularly of female children. Not every family did it. Many resisted, but the practice is recorded quietly, euphemistically, in temple logs and birth registers. Some monks wrote of unrecorded daughters. Others simply wrote nothing at all. And yet, even in this cruel calculus, there were women who resisted the silence. Midwives like Sada sometimes smuggled infants to monasteries, leaving them in baskets with bits of cloth and handwritten prayers. Some women, in secret, kept the babies alive by feeding them from their own rations, shrinking their own bodies into barely breathing shells so that one more girl might survive. There are folk songs from the time then, repetitive lullabies, that speak of these moments in metaphor. One, preserved in fragments, repeats the line, "The sparrow flew when no one watched, and came back as a crane." The song speaks of mothers hiding daughters in forests, then claiming they had vanished, only to retrieve them in the night and raise them in secret. But for most women, survival meant silence. They ate the least. It took what was left after men and boys had been served, and if nothing was left, they slept, curled like question marks on straw mats, holding the scent of boiled bark in their hair and empty bowls in their dreams. In the provincial court logs of the Wasuji clan, an unusual petition was recorded in 1633. It came from a village woman who asked the local magistrate for permission to keep a stolen grain sack. Her argument was simple. She had taken it not from another farmer, but from an abandoned daimyo storehouse during a bandit raid. She had hidden it for months, eating from it one pinch at a time, feeding two girls who were not her daughters but had been left on her doorstep. The petition was denied. The woman was sentenced to flogging, a spared death. The girls, according to the record, were reclaimed by the village. There is no further mention of what happened to them. History does not often preserve the details of women who ate last dot. Their names vanish from temple logs. Their bowls were counted, but never described. Their stories became part of the larger silence of famine, the kind that does not announce itself with bloodshed, but with the absence of breath in a room that once held laughter. And yet, the rice continued to be grown. The rituals continued. The silence remained. What do we make of a society where silence becomes a survival strategy? And what was left behind in those quiet spaces between a bowl passed over and a name never spoken aloud? By the time the rains returned to Ikago, the famine had already carved its mark deep into the bodies and memories of those who remained. It didn't arrive with ceremony. It wasn't greeted like a long-lost friend. It simply came in the form of thick, stubborn clouds in a low sky that finally broke open one humid afternoon. Water pooled in the cracks of dead rice paddies. Villagers stared upwards, blinking. But no one cheered, because when the rain comes after a famine, it doesn't heal. It only softens the ground where loss has already settled. You walk again through the village. Not the same one exactly, but one like it, further up the slope, where the thatch has thinned and the smoke from the hearths curls weakly toward a sky that's finally remembering how to weep. The hunger, for now, has eased. The next season's rice sprouts are tentatively pushing up through softened mud. Millet and buckwheat, those stubborn companions of desperate farmers, are beginning to anchor the fields again. But many of the women who had managed the famine, who carried it in their bodies and dreams, were gone. And of those who survived, few would speak of what they'd endured. Not because they'd forgotten, but because remembering was too costly. Take Naoko, for example, a woman in her 50s who lived with her daughter-in-law and grandson. She had once been robust, known in her village for singing while threshing. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, and she avoided the temple festivals altogether. During Oban, when the spirits of the dead were honored with lanterns and song, she remained inside, muttering prayers to her heart. Her grandson, born shortly after the rains returned, would never know that his grandmother had once buried a cloth-wrapped bundle behind the house. He would never know the name of the baby girl who had been born 2 seasons before him in a winter so silent that not even the village dogs barked anymore. That baby, Nyoko's granddaughter, had been born alive and full of need, but no one in the household had spoken her name. There had been no ceremony, just an absence, just a silence so full it had to wait. In a nearby temple, the monks updated their death registers. They used phrases like no record of survival or unconfirmed infant loss. In some cases, they wrote nothing at all. Some infants, especially girls, were never entered in the first place. The monks, sympathetic but constrained, knew that recording every death invited questions from the provincial magistrates, and sometimes the questions were more dangerous than the deaths themselves. Instead, new ritual emerged, unspoken, shared among women after the rains, when wildflowers began blooming in the roadside ditches. Mothers and midwives and daughters began to tie small paper dolls to tree branches at the edge of the forest. These were not the traditional teru, bazu, sunshine dolls meant to chase rain away, but something else entirely. These dolls had no faces, no names, just scraps of fabric wrapped around a small twig frame, their arms outstretched, their forms barely human. They were hung in clusters, quiet offerings, key, memory markers. They marked not the dead, but the forgotten. Some villagers, especially older men, found the practice strange. They called it ona no kamidoke, women's paper, clocks, a dismissive phrase, but they were wrong. These weren't clocks. They weren't trying to measure time. They were trying to hold still what history refused to carry forward. You can still find references to this practice in obscure Edo period poetry. A tanka by an unknown female poet reads, "Beneath the plum tree, hang dolls that do not smile back, rain on silent cloth. And not even the gods will ask whose daughter is on the wind." It's easy to read past those lines, easy to treat them as simple seasonal verses, but tucked within them is a truth that formal records never wrote down. The famine passed, but its wounds remained most deeply where silence had been a form of duty. In the decades that followed, as Japan edged toward more centralized governance and more complex census systems under the Tokugawa shogunate, birth registrations became stricter. So did rules about infanticide and adoption. The government didn't change its view because it suddenly valued girls. It changed because every head counted toward taxation, land rights, and rice allotments. In that sense, girls were finally counted, but for reasons as impersonal as those that once erased them. Some scholars reading these registries centuries later, were puzzled by spikes in female births during certain years. The explanation wasn't always more girls being born. It was simply more being acknowledged. Once a mouth could be counted toward a village's rice allotment, it was worth admitting she existed. But for the generation of women who had survived the famine, those changes came too late. They had already borne the weight of invisible daughters, already lived through winters where they served meals they would never taste, canned, mourned names they were never allowed to say aloud. The legacy of that silence lived on in lullabies with missing verses and temple bells rung for the ones who weren't, and in the quiet tapping of rain on roof tiles in late spring, when the rice had finally grown tall enough to ripple like water. There is no statue for the women who ate last dot. No scroll preserves the names of the girls whose deaths were not announced. But sometimes, on the edge of an old path leading to a forgotten village shrine, you might find a branch with a faded paper doll, arms open, face blank, swaying slightly in the breeze. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough to say, she was here. Asterisk, the year is 1663, and the empire is at its height. You are in the heart of Agra, once capital, now a jewel still gleaming in the light of Mughal ambition. The air smells of crushed rose petals, turmeric from the spice markets, and dust stirred from the feet of palace guards. Underneath it all is the low hum of bureaucracy petitions copied in Persian, orders translated from Arabic, court poets refining odes to aging emperors. Literacy is a pillar of the empire's might, but only in the hands of men. And yet, in one quiet household near the Yamuna River, a 12-year-old girl sits beside her grandmother, needlework in her lap, while her fingers trace invisible letters across her thigh, letters she is not supposed to know. Her name is Layli, not officially, of course. Official names belong to property deeds and court records. In this home, she is called Gulab, Panchiro's bird, a soft, affectionate name for a child who chirps, questions, and stares too long at things. Her father is a minor official, Moonsheet, tasked with copying land records. He writes quickly and beautifully, with ink that smells of burnt gum and vinegar, and his fingertips are always stained black. At night, when he comes home, he sets his inkwell carefully on the shelf above the hearth, believing it safe from small hands. But Layla's hands are never still. Asterisks, they pull thread, they pour water. And sometimes, when the household is asleep, they quietly reach for the inkwell and an old palm leaf scroll hidden beneath her grandmother's patchwork quilt. She has learned to read from fragments, from listening to her brother recite verses, from watching her father's wrist flick at the end of a word, from the slow murmuring of traders in the marketplace, their fingers dancing across account ledgers they carried tucked in their sleeves. Layli is clever, not just curious, not just bright, but deliberate in a way that women are rarely permitted to be. Her grandmother knows. Of course she does. She sees the ink smudges that appear on Layla's knuckles, the way her eyes move when someone reads aloud as though she is following the words on a page she alone can see. And maybe, in another world, this would be a story of secret pride, of a daughter elevated by her intellect, a household blooming under the light of learning. But this is not that world. In Mughal India, the literacy of girls is at once suspicious and shameful. In upper-class families, noble women are taught to recite poetry, to embroider verses of the Quran into silk. They memorize, but they do not write. They listen, but they do not annotate. To read for understanding, especially beyond religious texts, was something reserved for sons, for scribes, for judges, and poets, and imperial clerks. A girl who read, she was considered dangerous, or worse, wasted. Asterisk, because if a girl could read, she might read letters from a lover, or write them. She might keep ledgers and understand how much a husband earns. She might question what was written in the family contract. She might ask what was meant by obedience. And so girls were taught modesty in ink, obedience in silence, humility in repetition. Layli was not good at any of these. One day, a scroll goes missing. It's an old one of her father's childhood copy of Tales of the Prophets. Not sacred, but still respected. He reappears 2 days later, slipped carefully under the cushion where he sleeps during midday rest. He suspects nothing. Her mother, perhaps, senses something but says little. But her older brother, Idris, has begun to watch her more closely. He is 15, and his voice has taken on the scratchy authority of boys nearing manhood. He does not like to be outshone, especially by someone smaller, someone in skirts. One morning, during prayer, Layli missteps. She recites a line not spoken aloud in months, skewing a line from a page deep in a scroll that only Idris and their father ever read. Her voice is soft. It's too precise. Her brother stiffens. Asterisk. The next night, he follows her, quiet as he can. He sees the flicker of the oil lamp behind the curtain. He sees her bent over a scroll, lips moving in the rhythm of comprehension. He tells their father, not directly, careful, way that sons speak when they want to accuse without appearing disloyal. Appa, I believe Layli has a secret, one not fit for a girl. The phrase is weighted. There, father sets down his ink brush. Nothing is said that night, but the next morning, the scroll is gone. So is the inkwell, and Layli is called to her father's room. She walks slowly, eyes lowered, hands folded. The room smells of sandalwood and warm paper. Her father does not yell. He does not strike her. He simply asks, "Who taught you?" She cannot answer, because the truth is, no one did. Not entirely, but everyone did, in pieces, and none of them meant to dot. So she says nothing. Her father sighs. A girl who reads is a girl who cannot marry. You know this? It's not quite a question. She nods anyway. That night, her grandmother holds her close, braids her hair slowly, hums a lullaby from before the empire stretched this far, and under the blanket, she presses something into Layla's palm. A small stone, carved with a single letter, the Persian meme, the first sound of maktub. It is written Laleh, does not cry. She does not sleep. She stays still for hours, feeling the shape of the letter with her thumb. Somewhere beyond the stone walls of their home, scribes in red turbans carry scrawls across palace courts. Poets sharpen their pens with pearl-handled knives. Young men prepare for their first posts in the imperial bureaucracy. And in the quietest corner of this empire, a girl presses a letter-shaped stone to her chest and waits for a time that may never come. A time when her knowledge would be a gift, not a transgression. But what becomes of such girls? When the scrolls are taken away and the mouths are told to forget, when a daughter's cleverness becomes the family's shame. That is what we will begin to unravel next. Asterisk, Layli no longer reads, at least not with ink and scrolls, not with open lips or a visible light, but her eyes still trace everything, the painted verses above the prayer alcove, the grocery list scrawled, in the margins of used paper, is the birth certificate of her cousin, signed in broad, thick script and pressed into the family trunk. K, in the small chalkboards her brothers use when they learn their daily arithmetic. Everything to her is a page. It's been 3 weeks since the scroll was taken from her, since her father's eyes grew quiet with disappointment, since Idris stopped speaking to her at all and began speaking about her instead. She's not proper, he says once within her earshot. She listens when she shouldn't, remembers what she's not meant to remember. Her mother says little, but she begins to correct Layli more sharply. The seams of her dresses are checked. Her steps are scolded when they echo in the hallway. Her presence is managed never alone, always near someone older. Even her grandmother, warm and sun-softened, is pulled aside one afternoon. When she returns, K, her eyes are full of something, neither sorrow nor anger. Let the world believe you've forgotten, she whispers to Laylee, but never forget. So the lessons continue, just not aloud. Laylee begins to teach herself how to remember things without repeating them, how to read only with the edges of her vision, how to write entire verses into the folds of her memory, then erase them gently. Like a slate wiped clean before morning, she dreams in letters, in illuminated manuscripts filled with birds shaped like commas and vines twisting between vowels. She dreams of bookshelves behind locked doors, of court ladies passing folded notes behind fans, of a woman always faceless who sits in the emperor's library, reading without permission. But the world around her tightens at the Friday gathering. Okay. An elder neighbor begins to speak about the need for purity among daughters, not just in action, but in knowledge. Even women of the court, he warns, read only what they are given. The others nod. Laleh watches the dust in the corners of the room settle like ash. Watches her father stare at the coals, not defending her, not condemning her either. It is safer this way, to let the moment pass without consequence. The consequence doesn't disappear. It shifts. The real punishment arrives quietly. One day later, her father calls her into the courtyard at dawn. A man waits there, dressed in green silk, a teacher, old, nearly blind, but known to all he tutors, sons of merchants and scholars alike. He is not here for Laylee. He is here for Idris. The son is to become more an assistant at court, perhaps, or a clerk to the city's magistrate, and he must be sharpened, educated, refined every morning for the next 2 months. Idris will be taught in the courtyard, and Laylee is told to serve the tea. Just the tea, nothing more. So she stands behind him, silent every morning as the teacher speaks of jurisprudence, ethics, poetry, the weight of Persian grammar. She refills their cups as verses are recited. She watches the teacher's ink brush move across parchment with painful slowness, and she memorizes everything. It becomes her new school, one in which her body is invisible, but her mind is always reaching. She corrects Idris's misreadings. Silently, she whispers rhyming patterns into her scarf, just to hear the sound. She even begins to carve letters into the dirt with the toe of her shoe, letting the wind erase them before anyone can see. But Idris notices, and he does not like it. She stares, he tells their father. She distracts. I can't concentrate. So Layla is reassigned. She no longer pours tea in the courtyard. She is sent to the back garden to weed and sweep and prepare the clay stove. Her hands are to stay busy, ears out of reach. But even here, Layla adapts. She listens through the stone walls. She recites verses in rhythm with the broom's bristles. She scratches phrases into the side of a clay pot and rubs them away when the sun sets. Then, one day, everything breaks. It begins with a wedding. A distant cousin's marriage brings dozens of relatives into their home. With them come books gifts for the groom, beautiful ones, bound in red and gold. Poems of Hafiz, prayers of the Prophet, histories of the Delhi Sultanate. They are placed temporarily in the women's quarters, under a silk cloth, and one night, just past moonrise, Laylee slips away. She doesn't even touch the books. She only uncovers them. She stares for 10 minutes, just 10 at a single page, a ghazal written in the most delicate hand she's ever seen. And when she returns the cloth, she places it carefully, precisely, silently. But the next morning, her cousin finds the cloth crooked. That's all, just crooked, and the rumor begins. Again, someone has been reading. Laylee denies it. Her hands are clean. She has no ink, but Idris insists. She always watched the teacher. She used to trace letters on her thigh. K. She doesn't need ink, he says. She reads with her eyes, and for the first time, Her father does not defend her, not even with silence. He speaks. Then we must correct her eyes. The words are not metaphorical. The punishment is strange, ceremonial. Layli is not struck. She's not sent away. She is simply taken to the courtyard. Her books, what little she once had burned in a small clay bowl. Even the carved stone from her grandmother, hidden in a pocket for over a year, is thrown into the fire. And then a bowl of soot and oil is prepared. Her uncle, grim-faced and slow-moving, dips 2 fingers into the blackened paste and smears it across her eyelids. It is not painful. Not exactly, but it feels. Final.Laleh does not cry. She does not move. She stands in the courtyard with closed eyes, blackened lids, and listens to the crackling of her past reduced to ash. Her grandmother is not allowed to speak to her for 3 days. Her father avoids her completely, and her mother whispers, on the 3rd night, "You have embarrassed us." But still, Layli remembers. Not just the poems or the grammar, but the exact weight of that bowl in her uncle's hand. The way it tilted slightly before the paste was drawn. The way the silence after the fire sounded like a closing door. And so, the question remains, what happens to knowledge that cannot be destroyed? When the ink is burned, the eyes are darkened and still. The mind refuses to forget. Asterisk, they thought the soot would stay on her skin. That memory could be wiped with a cloth. That shame would make her small. But what they didn't understand is that reading had already rearranged her. Layli never returned to books in the way a scholar does. She was never again seated beside a scroll or gifted a stylus. She was not permitted near the court, nor praised for cleverness. She became, in the eyes of her family, a daughter corrected. Lesson learned. But within her, the words never stopped. On spoolling. She learned to hide her knowing better. She stopped moving her lips when she memorized prayers. She trained her face to look empty when paper passed before her eyes. Yet, the world, as it often does, changed without asking permission. By the time Layli was 17, the empire was shifting. Aurangzeb had begun his rise to power, and the court became a place of sharper edges. Art and poetry were no longer seen as soft pursuits. They were aesthetides, but under scrutiny. Education, even for men, was often weighed against piety, and many scholars found themselves accused of excess. Asterisk,